So you want to be a game master? Fantastic. Come on in, pull up a chair, take a load off. Welcome to the wonderful world of tabletop role-playing games. I personally love this hobby, and I've been running RPGs for over 40 years. Yes, I know. I'm old. Do have to mention that being a game master is a pretty daunting task, especially for those new to the hobby. And what I'd like to do is share some thoughts about how to possibly make your life as a game master easier. Today, I'll be discussing 4 things that I think are very important when selecting the right role-playing game for yourself and your group. And I'll get started right after this. Howdy, howdy, howdy. Welcome to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. As I mentioned in the open, I am going to be discussing 4 things that I think are very important when you're selecting the right role-playing game for yourself and your group. But first, I want to mention, if you are not familiar with the Gaming Gang or me, the Gaming Gang has been covering the world of tabletop gaming for over 10 years. We are actually in our 11th year of covering the hobby. Myself personally, I have been playing tabletop games for over 4 decades. Yes, and I have been running role-playing games for that long as well. I got started as a wee youngster back in 1978. So I'm pretty familiar with the hobby. So what I'd like to do is share a series of videos for those of you out there who are looking to take your first steps as a dungeon master, game master, keeper, referee, game mother, whatever you want to call the person who pretty much runs the action around the game table or facilitates the action around the game table while you're playing a role-playing game. So let's dive on in, because the first thing that I find to be important is genre. What sort of role-playing game are you looking to play with your friends? And the obvious answer to this may not necessarily be the right answer to this. And I'll give you an example. A few examples, actually. Let's say maybe you played Dungeons and Dragons when you were a kid and you want to share your love for D&D with your family. Or maybe you've got some friends that you want to introduce to the science fiction space lanes of Traveler. Or possibly have some coworkers you'd like to share the cosmic Lovecraftian horrors of Call of Cthulhu, which is actually my role-playing game of choice for over 40 years. Yes, I've been running Call of Cthulhu since it came out in its little 1-inch deep box back in 1981. Or maybe you have coworkers out there who are like, hey, you know what? I hear all these good things about Pathfinder. I really do wish somebody around here could run some Pathfinder. Any of these things are possible. But the key concept of genre is, what exactly is the setting of the role-playing game? So we have fantasy, which is kind of a default for many people because that's where Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder fall into the equation. But there are loads of fantasy role-playing games out there. Maybe you're looking for something that's very high fantasy, very epic fantasy. Something like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder is going to be a good fit for you. Maybe you're looking at something that's a little less magic, like what's considered to be low fantasy or low magic. There are many other role-playing games out there as well. Just off the top of my head, we've got Dungeons and Dragons, which is the 5th edition of that venerable role-playing game. We have Pathfinder in its second edition. We've got RuneQuest, which, gosh, I want to say, I think it's in its seventh. One of my personal favorites is Basic Fantasy. We've got Forbidden Lands. We've got original Dungeons and Dragons. We've got first edition Dungeons and Dragons, where you can see the books right behind me, two of them. 13th Age, the second edition of the Black Hack. There are loads and loads of role-playing games out there that cover fantasy. In fact, there are literally thousands of role-playing games out there. We are in the midst of a golden age of role-playing games. When I first got involved, you could count the number of role-playing games that you could find in a hobby shop, not a game shop, a hobby shop that was probably devoted to RC cars and model kits and things like that, kind of on one hand. Remember, we had the TSR releases, so you've got Dungeons and Dragons, Boot Hill, Gamma World, I think, was out at that time. You had Empire of the Petal Throne, which also came out through TSR. I don't think RuneQuest was out yet. So, like I said, there were maybe 2 or 3 role-playing games that you would find in your hobby shop, your local hobby shop. Well, that is not the case anymore. I also want to keep in mind, maybe you're looking at a specific property that you want to run a game in, like, say, Lord of the Rings, or one of my personal favorites are the stories of Fritz Leiber and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. I love those. You've got that available. Elric of Melna Bonnet, Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion. You have plenty of options out there. So the first thing you want to look at is genre. Maybe you want science fiction. You've got Mongoose Traveler, which I think is fantastic. You've got kind of science fantasy with Starfinder. If you're looking more towards kind of maybe gritty horror, kind of cosmic horror, you got Mothership. Obviously enough, we now have Alien, the RPG. So if you like the alien setting, there's Coriolis, Battle Lords of the 23rd Century. I mean, once again, loads and loads of RPGs. Maybe you want a horror game. Of course, once again, got my favorite, Call of Cthulhu. You've got Night's Black Agents. There's Chill, which I believe is in their 3rd edition. A relatively new RPG that's out there that's really, really cool is Lawson, which is from Free League Publishing. Trail of Cthulhu, which is Lovecraftian, but more towards the kind of mystery side of things. Very, very interesting. We've got Delta Green, which is kind of modern Lovecraft horror. Once again, loads and loads of horror options out there. So essentially, the first thing you're looking at is, what is the genre? What do we want to play? And you might have friends out there who already tell you, hey, you know what? I really want to play Dungeons and Dragons. I really want to play Star Trek Adventures. I want to play Star Wars. So you've got those options available to you. So the first thing you're going to address is, what is the genre that you are looking to play within? Next thing I want to talk about are actually 3 items that are kind of tied together. Talking about mechanics, crunch, and fluff. So if you're not overly familiar with role-playing games, you're going to hear these terms quite often: mechanics, crunch, and fluff. And I'll explain basically what we're talking about here in layman's terms. And got to point out, in this hobby, everybody's got an opinion. So you're going to run across tons of different opinions. Once again, this is just my take on these terms. So mechanics is basically what are the rules of the game? Crunch is kind of the same way. It's like the rules of the game. But the mechanics are, how do you mechanically resolve situations where the outcome is uncertain? And it's usually through dice. Vast majority of the time, it's through dice. Now, if it's all related to rolling a 20-sided die, then usually the mechanics are D20. You might have a dice pool where you're rolling a certain number of 6-sided dice that equate to your skills in a certain particular type of thing, say like, I don't know, spaceship mechanics, spaceship repair, spaceship piloting, what have you, reading foreign languages, speaking foreign languages. So you'd be rolling some 6-sided dice and you're adding the totals up, looking to meet or exceed a target number. You might be looking at a system that also uses a D6 pool where you're rolling 6-sided dice and all you're looking to do is get a 6 on any of those dice and you succeed. You also have percentiles where you're rolling 2 10-sided dice. One is the single digits, the other is the tens, and you're going to use that to get a number between 1 and 100. Regardless how you actually resolve these actions, it's usually how you roll the dice that are basically your mechanics. How do you resolve things that are not just a given? So we have crunch, and crunch tends to be how many of these mechanics come into play. At least that's how I look at crunch. The more rules, the more different rules to resolve actions, to me, makes a game crunchier. Now, the opposite of crunchy is usually called rules light, where you don't have a ton of different rules to resolve different things. So as an example, you might have a game where, once again, let's use that D20. You're going to roll a 20-sided die, and you might resolve all of your actions based upon rolling equal to or less than an attribute. Say strength, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, charisma, constitution, what have you. And the vast majority of your action resolution is resolved that way. That tends to be a rules light system. A crunchy system is going to have a variety of different ways for you to resolve your actions. So as an example, we'll use, say, first edition Dungeons and Dragons, which came out the year I was introduced to role-playing games. So you would have a D20 and you'd be rolling for combat, right? So you'd be rolling for combat. So that would be a 20-sided die resolution. If you were a thief and you were trying to hide in the shadows or trying to pick a pocket, you would actually be rolling 2 10-sided dice. So you'd be rolling percentile dice to see if you succeeded. And you would be, say, dungeon delving, and you would be rolling to see if you'd spot a hidden door. Usually your game master would roll that. You might be looking at a 1 in 6 chance. So you're rolling a 6-sided die, or they're rolling a 6-sided die. So once again, we have all these various different mechanics all being resolved differently, but still in the same game system. That tends to make a game crunchier. Then we have fluff. Fluff, in my opinion, is simply game world building, history, background, like monster, not necessarily the stats, but talking about like the physiology of creatures and monsters and various different races that are available to the players, or as non-player characters, or as simply villains, or, monsters you're going to battle. All of that to me is fluff. So anything that's not actually game rules related tends to be considered to be fluff. Now, just because it's called fluff doesn't mean it's bad. What you'll find in most role-playing games, especially if they have a single core rule book, is you'll see most companies try to affect a balance between game mechanics and crunch as well as fluff. Usually, not always, but usually you'll find the games that are rules light, their core books will contain more fluff, whereas games that are crunchier, have more rules systems in them, tend to have a little less fluff in the core rule books. Normally, there's more information available as additional supplements that are out there. So, another really important aspect of what game you choose is going to be how much crunch do you want in your gameplay? How many rules do you feel you want to have to sit and memorize or have players memorize, which we'll talk about that in another video. And the thing is, there are some games that are very, very crunchy that people kind of gravitate to because they've been told, hey, you should really, we play this, you should play this. And that crunch is going to turn the game master off of the game. So once again, using some examples, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons at its heart mechanically is not very crunchy. There are not a ton of different rules that you need to memorize in order to run Dungeons and Dragons. That said, when you start adding in the magical spells and the various different cultures that the player characters can come from and different backgrounds for the character classes, now you're suddenly stacking other items on top of what is essentially a pretty easy rule set, but making the game a bit more complex for the game master to run. Pathfinder, 2nd edition of Pathfinder, is also very, very popular, is a more crunchy system than 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. You can go down to more rules light systems like original Dungeons and Dragons. Obviously enough, they didn't have tons and tons of rules. You've got old school essentials if you're looking for more of a vibe of how role-playing games were played back in those late 70s, early 80s. You've got loads and loads of options out there. The Black Hack 2nd edition, very, very popular with a lot of people for very, very rules light. I am a big fan of Basic Fantasy, which is available absolutely free over at basicfantasy.org. And it combines a bit of a modern feel as well as an old school feel together. Really, really like that. Plus, it's absolutely free. So that's something you really got to take a look at is mechanics. Because, sorry to say, your players are not going to necessarily memorize mechanics. Some will. You might have some players out there who are what we like to term rules lawyers. But for the most part, most players will learn as they go. They are not going to know how these game mechanics work right off the bat, nor will some of them games and games down the line. Keep that in mind. If you like more tactical combat, if you like a lot of player creation options, then you're probably going to lean toward a much crunchier rule system. If you're looking more towards story and getting the most bang for your buck out of each of your gaming sessions, depending on how long each of your sessions turns out to be, you might be looking at more of a rules light sort of game as well. Something else I also point out, people will hear new school and old school. Once again, a lot of different interpretations of what those terms mean. New school is essentially newer role-playing games where the focus tends to be on the player characters. The player will sit down and a lot of times roll up a character away from the rest of the group and concoct a serious, deep backstory about that character, hoping that the game master, or in the case of Dungeons and Dragons, the dungeon master, will be able to incorporate that background into the adventures that they play. Old school tends to be less rules heavy, rules intense. In fact, one of the terms used for old school is it's about rulings, not rules. But so something else that also takes place is that the character creation, the character is more focused on their backstory is created through the adventures that they go on. You don't have as many creation options for your character, and the character background is actually created through the adventures that you play. It's one of the ways that I kind of resolve old school and new school. There's a lot of different aspects to it as well. The third thing you'd be looking for is how much support is available for the game and how accessible is that content. I know a lot of game masters out there, they get started, they're like, oh yes, I'm gonna create this game, and this is the game world I want, and it's just, fantastic, amazing ideas. But unfortunately, putting those into action is much more difficult than you would think. So I always recommend trying to look for a game system that is going to have some support materials out there. Unfortunately, there are a lot of really interesting role-playing games that all that's out there is essentially the core rule book, and everything is then kind of dropped into the game master's lap as far as creating the content, the adventures, the world building, the backstory. All of that is in the hands of the game master. And hey, there are a lot of game masters who are fantastic at creating those worlds and those backgrounds and everything else, but usually not right off the bat, not just entering the hobby. So what I recommend is taking a look at systems that are going to have a lot of support materials for them, regardless of genre. So, of course, Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Traveler, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu, Trail of Cthulhu, all of these systems have a lot of support material available for them and easily accessible as well. So if you are a fan of digital content, those games, except for D&D, the core books and that usually are not available just as a standard PDF. They tend to be available digitally through essentially through a tabletop program. So, or virtual tabletop, as people like to call them, VTTs. So you need to have, say, Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or D&D Beyond in order to get those digital files. Makes it a little tricky. The vast majority of other role-playing games out there do have PDFs that are available for you to read on just about any PDF reader. So I always recommend, as a new game master, to get a system that's got some good support materials out there. You can make the game yours. You can do whatever you want with it. You can get some published adventures, check them out, get an understanding of how the game actually works, how adventures are constructed and presented, and then tear them apart and build them back up however you would like. Remember, it's your game. I'm just trying to point out some easy ways to get started in your game. My final item that I want to mention, and I got to be honest, a lot of people overlook this. Number 4 is the personal appeal that game is going to have for you. A lot of times, gamers out there will tell a prospective game master, hey, you know what? They really want to play XYZ game. That is the game they want to play. And the person who's being kind enough to be the game master says, okay, cool. I'll pick up the materials that we need, the rule books, adventures, what have you. Hopefully some of your friends are kicking in towards that, but they're going to pick it up and they're going to run the game. And then it turns out that the game that they've been shackled effectively in running is not a great fit for them. They are not super pumped to be running that game, and it will be reflected at the game table, and that game group will not play very long together. Sorry to say, that happens a lot. So it's important for the prospective game master to understand they need to run a role-playing game that they are excited to run in a setting or genre that they are excited about. So if you have friends who are all sitting around saying, hey, Bob, we really want you to run Star Trek Adventures, but you are not a big Star Trek fan, it's probably not going to work out. If you have folks who are sitting there saying, oh, Linda, we really, really want to play games in Middle Earth We want J.R.R. Tolkien role-playing, and you are not a J.R.R. Tolkien fan, it is not going to work out very well. So one thing that I always mention is gamers tend to play what's available to them by way of their game master, as long as it's within reason. So as an example, maybe players want to play Pathfinder, but you feel more comfortable with Dungeons and Dragons. I guarantee they're going to play Dungeons and Dragons, not Pathfinder, because you are setting the tone at the game table with the game you've selected. In other words, gamers tend to not be beggars rather than choosers, because they don't have a vast number of game masters out there to be running from table to table. So you can easily set the tone and set the game setting and genre that you would prefer. Do not get stuck into purchasing game materials and investing a lot of time in prepping for a role-playing game that you are not jazzed to be running at your table. You will not have a good time. Your players will not have a good time. And that group probably will not stick together too long to be playing that game. Stick with something you really are excited about, and that excitement will extend to your players regardless if they're interested in that role-playing game or not. Usually. All right, so there you have 4 different items that you should be looking at when selecting the right role-playing game for you and your group. Genre, mechanics, crunch, and fluff, support for that game, and the personal appeal that game has for you. All right, that is it for this time out. If you'd like to see more videos in this series, by all means, please comment below. And I've got plenty of thoughts and ideas that I can share with you from my over 40 years of running role-playing games. All right, so I do want to point out, if you like this video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Where has it disappeared to? There we go. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already, and if you do subscribe, ding that bell. It'll not only let you know when I upload videos such as this, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Monday through Thursday nights right here on YouTube as I bring you the latest in tabletop gaming news. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all the latest in gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Thanks for watching, and of course, I tend to be wrapping up my videos during this never-ending pandemic, hoping that everyone out there is being smart and staying safe. Oh, hey, you're still here. Well, if that's the case, by all means, if you haven't subscribed to the Gaming Gang channel yet, click right here. If you'd like to see the latest episode of the Gaming Gang Dispatch, click right up there. And if you want to trust YouTube's algorithm to give you something to watch, click right there. Once again, thanks so much for watching, and everybody please wear a mask.